Hey guys, we're back with more notes on civilizations in Mesopotamia. So, in our previous notes, we talked about all things Sumer and the Sumerian city-states and how their culture influenced, pretty much life in the region for a long time. In this set of notes, we're going to talk about the other civilizations that came after them. So these are other Mesopotamian civilizations that expanded the reach of Mesopotamian culture and started the world's first empires. So let's just dive right into it and talk about how this comes about. So first off, when we're talking about Mesopotamia, before I said with Sumer that they were a collection of city states. And if you look at this map, you can see that there's a lot of cities that are all really close together, right? That these are some pretty small, there's a bunch just kind of compacted into this small area in what is southern Mesopotamia, right along the Persian Gulf there. Cities like Ur and Uruk are, in that lower region. And for about 1,000 years or so, um, before 2000 BCE, the city states were pretty much constantly at war with one another. They were fighting over resources. They were competing for better farmland. Just constant war with each other. Um, Even though they shared culture and were very similar in other respects, they were competing for resources. There's a lot of cities there that need a lot of resources, so they were competitive with each other in order to get them. And I want you to answer this question in a discussion thread. How would the fact that these city states are constantly at war with one another allow them to be conquered by an outsider? There's this guy named Sargon of Akkad who would create the first empire, um, and it's called the Akkadian Empire uh, after him and where he was from. So, in the discussion thread, I want you to answer the question: is how does the city states being constantly at war with one another allow them to be conquered by Sargon of Akkad? Okay, there's a note in there for this birth story. So let me tell you the story of Sargon's birth and see if it sounds familiar to any of you. Sargon was born, it was said, of a virgin. Um, it was a virgin birth, and his mother did not want the baby. So what she did was she put baby Sargon into uh, a basket and put him in the river, and the river took him to the land of Akkad, where he was then found by a member of the royal family and taken in as a ruling prince to then who would then go back and conquer his original homeland, which was in southern Mesopotamia. It should sound kind of similar to someone whose story we know a little bit more, and that's Moses, right? Outside of the virgin birth thing, that's pretty much the story of Moses' birth. So we have yet another example, as we've seen with the Epic of Gilgamesh, another example of cultural diffusion, right? That there's these stories that are told of these great men, and they kind of get co-opted and borrowed and all these other things. So, is that true? Maybe. Did it actually happen to Sargon, or was it really Moses? Did it happen to both of them? We really don't know. We just know that there's usually this kind of mythology, right? This myth making around these great men in the ancient world. Um, so, just something interesting for you to kind of think about and see how all these things are connected. So, once Sargon has control of the region, and has all these other city states, under his control, he starts expanding, right? And this is where we see the first empire in human history being created. Um, One of the cool things that he did, though, was he allowed the original culture, the Sumerian culture, to continue. He adopted most of the religious beliefs of the Sumerians, or the Akkadians adopted most of the religious beliefs of the Sumerians, and even more importantly, adopted the writing system cuneiform and spread that throughout the region. So empire building becomes this uh, great force of cultural diffusion, right? That the Akkadians could have stomped out the Sumerian culture and squashed it before it could really flourish, but instead they allowed it to continue, and that's how we know about the Sumerian civilization to this day. And it's how cuneiform spread throughout the region, right? This writing system that we've been talking about in class. So, as far as empires are concerned, the Akkadians were pretty successful. Um, but they weren't the only game in town. So while they were pretty successful, their tenure, they didn't last all that long, because shortly after the Akkadian Empire uh, rises, it collapses and gets taken over by the Babylonian Empire. Again, this is all in southern Mesopotamia, same region where all those city-states are in the south there. And the Babylonian Empire gets started by a guy by the name of Hammurabi. Um, Hammurabi is very famous for a number of things, but his most famous accomplishment is creating the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi's code is a set of laws that were sent throughout the region. Hammurabi would write down the laws in stone. They were engraved in stone. This is the first time that laws and rules get written down. Before, it was just whatever the king decided was what the king decided. You know, the king decides that he doesn't like you, then he rules against you, and that's, too bad. You're not the king. But now you have Hammurabi saying, here are all the laws that everyone in my empire needs to follow. They are applied equally, although not everyone was equal before the law. But by making the laws public, engraved in stone, and put out throughout the cities, they showed that the government had a responsibility for what happened. Most of the laws are about, like, what we would call, civil disturbances now. A neighbor, cuts down a tree and it falls on, your house. What can you do about it? Before then, the government just said, well, you figure it out, right? What does that have to do with the king? But now, right, for the first time ever, Hammurabi is saying that the government is responsible for what happens to its citizens. Now, it might kill them if they break any of the laws, which is pretty much what they did. Everything was based on retaliation. But, still, it shows that the government's going to get involved in these disputes, and they're going to have rules that they're going to have to follow. This is a huge step forward in terms of human history, guys. Both in terms of the role that the government has, and in terms of the fact that the laws were written down, right? Think of what that means. That means that anybody who knows how to read or write can understand what these laws are. You don't need to just trust what people are saying is legal or illegal. They actually can figure it out for themselves. I mean, can you imagine if we didn't have a student handbook, and every day you could get in trouble for something that you didn't even know was against the rules, right? Writing it down provides everyone kind of a baseline of what to expect. It's really, really important in terms of, legal systems and, making sure everybody's treated fairly. So Hammurabi's code, huge step forward. They put them on pillars that were placed throughout all the cities. So there's an example of one. Normally, we would go later in the year to the Penn Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology, if that's possible this year. Then I'm sure we'll go back. But they have a Hammurabi's code there as well. So, fingers crossed that we'll be able to go back so that you can see one in person. But again, this is the first time that a ruler sought to codify the laws, or in other words, put them down in writing. That would govern all the people of the state. So let's look at what some of these laws were, right? Why not? So here's a number of them. My favorite's number 2. If anyone brings an accusation against a man and the accused go to the river and leap into the river, if they sink in the river, his accuser shall take possession of his house. But if the river proves that the accused is not guilty and he escapes unhurt, then he who brought the accusation shall be put to death, while he who leaped into the river shall take possession of the house and all that belonged to his accuser. So think about what that's saying. It's kind of like there's this divine justice, right? So if I accuse you of stealing, let's say, and you're so distraught that I just accused you of stealing that you go and jump into the river, right? Probably an act that would end your life. If you die, then clearly you were guilty, right? The gods are showing that you were guilty, so they let you die in the river, and therefore I, as the person who brought the charges, gets to keep all of your possessions. But if you survive the river miraculously, then obviously you are innocent. So therefore, I should be killed for bringing up a false allegation, and all of my stuff will be given to you who survived. That's a really good way to prevent people from bringing up false accusations, right? There's another one. The next one, actually, if anyone brings an accusation of a crime and does not prove what he's charged, he shall be put to death, right? So don't waste our time with things that you're not sure of, right? You have to be able to prove it. Um, you know, uh, Even the last one, right? We have in the number 7 there. We have a definition of of theft, right? So we have, instead of just saying like, is it theft? Is it not theft? Is it really stealing? Does it count if it's this? What about that? They're saying no. Look, here it is. If you do these things without an exchange of property, um, then it's considered theft, and you're going to be put to death for stealing. So I'm sure you're looking at this and thinking that there might be some themes, and it is pretty much everything's based off of death. If you don't do something, you're put to death, or if you do something wrong, you're put to death. Um, it's just kind of how it is. They're not going to waste government resources on putting people in jail. If you were, you know, not an upstanding citizen, then they didn't have the time or resources to waste on you, so they would just, end your life. Um, But Hammurabi's code very much based on retaliation. This is where we get the phrase "an eye for an eye." That's literally in Hammurabi's code. If you do something and it causes someone else to lose an eye, then your eye is plucked out. Um, it's it's kind of fair in a weird way, weird and like what's the word I'm looking for? Torturous, right? It's weird and torturous way, but it's kind of fair. We'll read more about this in class or for a homework assignment. But let's talk about Hammurabi, because there's more to the man besides an awesome name, a great beard, and his legal code. Hammurabi did a number of other things during his 45-year reign that are of note. So first, he created, he didn't create an army, but his army became one of the most well-disciplined armies in the region, if not the world. They had the height of technology, battle axes, spears, copper and bronze daggers, things that were well above his enemies in terms of what they had to offer. He also had a new tactic: divide and conquer. He knew that if he could split up his enemies into smaller groups and attack them with the full force of his army, then he'll be able to win. And he did. This is how he became the emperor of Babylon. This is how Babylon expanded into the city-states of Sumer and eventually took over the empire from the Akkadians. But he wasn't all about violence and injury. He also started major public works, right? So public works are things that are good for the public to use. So he built temples, irrigation ditches, new walls to surround the new cities that he just conquered, right? These things were beneficial to everyone. They kept people safe. People like new temples because it's, they're getting to worship their gods in new ways. People like new stuff. Irrigation ditches help the farmers and provide steady food supply to the city. So public works, great things that rulers do. In the U.S., we might call this infrastructure. And infrastructure is very important topic in our country's politics as well. Socially speaking, he establishes a new capital, creates the city of Babylon, or makes the city of Babylon its capital, creating the Babylonian Empire. But just like Sargon before him, allowed other Mesopotamian cultures to exist as they were. He didn't come in and say everyone has to, switch to doing things this way. You can keep doing it the way you were. Just make sure that that I'm in charge. And he encouraged people to travel throughout the empire to trade their goods and services. This led to economic advancement and really helped out people in the region. And last but certainly not least, Hammurabi was a big fan of the Babylonian god Marduk. Marduk was the god of the city of Babylon. He is extremely important, who will show up again and again and again and again and again in our talk about Mesopotamian culture. So this is a name you'll remember. And while he allowed Mesopotamian culture to exist, he kind of promoted this god and said, "Hey, look, he's kind of the main god. He's my main god. This is all this stuff." So that's all the things that Hammurabi did. And you might be thinking, okay, this seems like a lot. Is there possibly a handy dandy chart that I can use, a little graphic organizer, if you will, that puts things in a nice, more easily digestible way? And I got just the thing for you. So imagine, this will help you if you're ever asked a question about how Hammurabi unified his empire, right? So if you're out at Christmas and you're on a Zoom call with your cousins, and your cousins are like, "Hey, do you know anything about Hammurabi and how he unified his empire?" Or if you're out in hanging out socially distanced outside, and your neighbor comes over and says, "Hey, you're at Holy Ghost. You must know something about this Hammurabi guy and his empire." Here's something that you can use to help answer someone who might ask you a question about how Hammurabi unified his empire. So there you go. You could respond to them and say Hammurabi unified his empire using the law, the military, public works, and religion. By using the law, by making the law written down and spread throughout his empire, he made sure that everybody was unified because they all followed the same law. His army, right, the military, was well trained, and it allowed him to bring all these people under his rule, unifying them by his power. Public works, improving irrigation systems and building temples and walls make people happy and make people want to stay under the leadership of Hammurabi. And by religion, by promoting the god of Marduk, saying, "Hey, look, this is the main god of my city. Maybe you should look into him." That gets people all believing in a similar god, which also unifies people and brings them together. So there you go. On one slide, the great answer to someone who maybe sometime in the future might ask you a question, how Hammurabi unified his empire. You now have that answers right there for you, ready to go. All you got to do is remember this information. So make sure you take it down in your notes and review it, just in case that person happens to ask you. I don't know, maybe sometime in the next 2 weeks. I'm not sure really when that might happen, but it could, and that way you're prepared. So that's it for Sargon and Hammurabi. We'll come back in our next set of videos and talk about other empires. We'll touch back on the Hittites, the Assyrians, and then the Neo-Babylonians. This group of this new Babylonian empire that started a few thousand years after Hammurabi. But that's it. I will see you guys next time.